Given how big of a roster it's had over the years, it should come as no surprise that there are always plenty of wrestlers working for WWE who get lost amongst the cracks. But while for some performers this is more excusable, for others it's downright criminal, as by all accounts they could have been a focal point of whatever show they were on at any given time. But who are the biggest examples of this in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with arguably the biggest example of them all, Shinsuke Nakamura. That's right, how could we not start here? After all, if we're talking about sheer talent, then there are few in the entire world who can match the King of Strong Style. And that was evident throughout his epic run in Japan between 2002 and 2016, where he became a 3-time IWGP Heavyweight Champion and 5-time IWGP Intercontinental Champion. So when it was announced he'd signed with WWE in 2016 then, it felt like the promotion had just managed to pull off their biggest signing in years, which was exactly why it stung so much when things never quite went according to plan for him. Sure, Nakamura would have a solid run down in NXT where he became a 2-time world champion and had that classic against Sami Zayn, but since moving up to the main roster in 2017, the Kyoto native has been less King of Strong Style and more King of the Mid-Card. Why has this happened to him? Well, there are a few possible explanations, with one of the most likely being that he decided he wanted to take it easy going forward now that he no longer had to worry about doing New Japan-style matches. But even if he wasn't going to be giving us bangers anymore, Shinsuke's superhuman levels of charisma should have been enough to see him get by in WWE, or at least it might have been if Vince McMahon hadn't still been writing the show then. And so because of the last fact, we got one of the best wrestlers in the world being treated like a total afterthought for the most part. Yes, it is true that Shinsuke had a couple of short runs in the main event, once during his feud with AJ Styles back in 2018, and then again when he had a brief resurgence in late 2023 when he suddenly found himself in a main event feud with Seth Rollins, but ever since that ended, he's been de-pushed right back down the card. And then this leaves us back at square one with him again in the sense that he's one of the greatest of his generation, and in terms of his usage, he's also one of the most undervalued. But at least Shinsuke Nakamura can take some solace in the fact he's not the only hugely talented performer who undervalued in WWE during the late 2010s, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, Bobby Roode. Now, we were never expecting Bobby Roode to be a world champion in WWE or anything, but considering what he can do in the ring, you'd have thought the company would have wanted to do something with him after they signed him to a contract in 2015. After all, here was another man who had already proven himself elsewhere by becoming a 2-time TNA World Champion and 6-time TNA World Tag Team Champion. Unfortunately though, this was another case of Vince McMahon having absolutely no idea what he had, as after a pretty good run on NXT where the Glorious One became a 1-time NXT champion, he'd be called up to the main roster, where any momentum he had was instantly nuked. What happened here exactly? Well, rather than push him as the badass heel which had gotten him so over on the black and gold brand, the boss immediately decided to recast Roode as a fully nerfed babyface, probably on account of the fact he had a theme song that was over with fans. Still, this didn't have to be the end for the Ontario native. No, he could have recovered from this miscasting and flourished in WWE as a hero. However, he didn't because his subsequent booking would never give him the chance to do so. No, rather than get storylines to work with, the former NXT champion would instead be sent straight into the dead zone that was the SmackDown mid-card, where his only highlights included feuding with Baron Corbin over the United States title. And once he was moved over to Raw, things would get even worse, as there his time would mostly be spent in the tag team division as the partner of Dolph Ziggler. And outside of a couple of notable periods, tag team wrestling has never really meant much in recent years. So it should come as little surprise that this only caused Roode's stock to fall further, with it continuing to fall until he finally decided he'd had enough when in 2023 he retired from the ring to take on a role as a backstage producer instead. But Bobby Roode isn't the only current backstage producer working for WWE who was once undervalued in the ring. No, we could say the same things about our next subject too, Billy Kidman. Yes, as it stands today, the 7-time Cruiserweight Champion, 3-time Tag Team Champion, and 1-time boyfriend of Tori Wilson serves an important role backstage in WWE as a match producer. Before that, though, his talents were often going to waste, as whenever he was on screen on either Raw or SmackDown, he was never given the focus he deserved. But then maybe that shouldn't be surprising, as this was back during the early 2000s, a particularly difficult time to be a wrestler in WWE whose height started with a 5. And so no matter how good he was, there was always going to be a bit of an albatross around the New Haven native's neck. Not that he did nothing, of course. No, despite having everything working against him, Kidman still won multiple titles in WWE in the form of the Cruiserweight and Tag Team titles. Unfortunately, though, he was never really given the chance to mix it up with any of the true main eventers, and there was just no opportunity for Billy to grow and expand beyond this and prove what he could do in a more prominent role. Now, all he'd be allowed to do during his time under Vince McMahon's employ was be a high flyer who could serve a mid-card role. But it's not like he wasn't given any chances before he spent time in WWE, as back during his run in WCW, he had a brief foray into the main event scene when he even pinned Hulk Hogan 3 times. Still, things worked out well for Kidman in the end, as after initially parting ways with WWE in 2005, he'd return again in 2007 under the new guise of backstage producer, with this being a role he continues in all the way up to the present day. And that's meant he's been there to help our next subject attempt to get the recognition she deserves. Who are we talking about here? Why, Shazi, of course. That's right, we're now going to make the case that of all the women on the WWE roster currently, Shazi might be the most undervalued. After all, if you were following her on the indies before she made it to WWE, then you'd know just how entertaining she can be. If you're just a fan of hers from her work over the last few years, though, you might not be aware of this, as well on SmackDown and NXT, she's never really managed to break through to the next level. Not that she hasn't been allowed to go out there and cut promos or have matches, of course. It's more that she's not really been given enough time in either of these areas to establish herself. And that's a shame, because with such a unique character and look to her, there's every chance WWE could have a star on their hands if they just pulled the trigger. Hell, we've already seen glimpses of her skills and her ability to act as a host for Halloween Havoc down on NXT. And we've seen even further glimpses of this in her entrances, where she's driven a mini-tank down to the ring. Will she break out at any point in the future? That remains to be seen. In the meantime, all the Santa Clara County native can do is continue on with what she's doing, as she hopes to eventually get the chance she deserves. Who knows? If she starts to build momentum, then we could be looking at a future women's champion here. And if this happens, then Shazi will finally be able to say she's no longer undervalued. But she's not the only undervalued woman in current-day WWE. No, our next subject has also been cursed with the same fate. And when we're talking about someone as good as Candace LeRae, that's all the more upsetting for her. Of course, when we talk about Candace here, we're specifically talking about her time on the main roster, because down on NXT between 2018 and 2022, she did find herself with a solid spot on the card. No, she was never presented as a serious contender to the world title or anything, but she was always given something to do, whether that be challenging people like Io Shirai, standing in the corner of her husband Johnny Gargano, or winning tag team gold with Indy Hartwell. Once she was called up to Raw in 2022, however, things took a downturn. And this downturn can't be blamed on Vince McMahon either, as by that point it was Triple H in charge of the day-to-day booking. So why had the game forgotten about the Riverside native now that she was working on a different night of the week? That's hard to say. Maybe he just thought the Raw audience wouldn't want any of what she'd been doing on NXT prior to this. Whatever the reason, the end result was the same, and this was that from here on in, Candace LeRae would be relegated to the role of occasional appearances on Monday nights, usually so she could put over a more focused upon talent. Does she deserve better than this? Absolutely, as she's shown time and time again how much more she can be if given the chance. But for one reason or another, as it stands right now, it doesn't appear like WWE's booking team thinks she has what it takes to be anything more on the main roster. And so because of that, she's going to have to continue waiting for her chance to shine until something changes and there's a turnaround in her fortunes. Not that she should be too dismayed by this though, because these turnarounds can come. Hell, it came for our next subject during the early 2010s. Prior to him getting over with his Hall of Pain gimmick, however, Mark Henry was easily one of the most undervalued wrestlers on the WWE roster. Now we know this one might not seem like an obvious choice, as while no one is going to argue 2010's Mark Henry wasn't main event level, the general consensus seems to be that prior to this, he wasn't all that. But we're here to argue that this wasn't a result of his talent. No, it was instead merely a consequence of his booking. Sure, his early years in the WWF did see him have to learn on the job, and for that reason he was pretty green throughout the Attitude Era and beyond. But even if he wasn't able to go to the highest level in the ring back then, the world's strongest man was always entertaining. Need we remind you about some of the weird and wacky angles he was a part of during the turn of the millennium? Yes, it was back then that Mark was doing things like romancing China or getting Mae Young pregnant, two of the most bizarre angles of the era. And then of course there was what he did after that, as once the Ruthless Aggression era came around, we saw the first signs of the main eventer he'd become during his feuds with the likes of Batista, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. Hell, at one point he'd even get to challenge The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak. And while he wasn't successful in ending this streak, the very fact he held his own in that position was a sign he was ready for bigger and better things. So when these bigger and better things finally came for him in 2011, it was welcomed by fans everywhere, as by that point, we all knew he was good enough. We only wish it could have happened earlier, as if we'd gotten some extra time with the Hall of Pain gimmick, it might have even further cemented the Texan as a Hall of Famer. But things didn't work out that way, and so instead, the first decade and a half of the world's strongest man's career will have to go down as an undervalued period for him. A period where he could have been doing so much more had it been figured out he had it earlier. But what about our next subject? Someone who was around all the way back in the Golden Era, as that was when he was failing to fully capitalize on the talents he had. Who are we talking about here? Why, Tito Santana, of course. That's right, if you were a fan of the WWF back during the age of Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage, then you'll no doubt remember the quiet popularity of Tito Santana. That said, this didn't mean Vince McMahon used him to his fullest potential. No, despite being over with fans, Santana was mostly slotted into a mid-card role whenever he appeared on TV, with the most he achieved in terms of singles title success being 2 runs with the Intercontinental title in 1984 and 1985. Had things been different though, he could have been so much more than that. In fact, we're pretty sure there were points where you could have made him the world champion, and fans would have ran with it. Of course, for this to happen though, the Texan would have had to get the green light from his boss, and with his boss more enamored with the cultural juggernaut that was Hulkamania, there was little chance this was ever going to occur. So instead of being a breakout superstar, Tito Santana ended up remaining in the mid-card for his entire run, someone who did have success, but who was never really thought of as the guy at any particular moment. Yes, it's true that this almost changed when Hulk Hogan left during the early 90s and Santana allegedly made the shortlist for Vince McMahon's top babyface. But given his age at that point, and given the growing popularity of Bret Hart, it's no real surprise the Hitman got this role instead. So what became of Tito after this? Well, like a true babyface, after hanging up his boots, he'd use his time in retirement to become a teacher. And it's in this role he continues on today, with him still helping the kids any way he can. And it's in the same role our next subject currently sits too, sort of, as while he's not a school teacher, he is a trainer and backstage producer for TNA. That's right, it's time to talk about Lance Storm. Now, if we're talking about pure bell-to-bell wrestling, then Lance Storm is easily one of the best performers of his generation. And it's these skills which saw him rise all the way to the top of the WCW Cruiserweight division multiple times during the late 90s. Once he joined WWE during the Invasion, however, things stalled quite a lot for him, as with the Ontario native having a perceived lack of charisma, WWF bookers just never really saw much in him beyond the mid-card. Of course, the idea that Lance Storm has zero charisma was never quite accurate, as his "Can I be serious for a minute" character was something he was being asked to do specifically. But once he was typecast in a certain way, it was pretty much guaranteed death for him as a character. And this meant no matter how many good matches he had against the likes of Edge, Rikishi, and even The Rock, there was always going to be a ceiling on what he was going to achieve there. Even when he was given more entertaining characters to play, such as when he was part of the Un-Americans alongside Christian, Test, and William Regal, it was already clear that there were no plans to do anything of note. Maybe he just came along at the wrong time then, because had he been in WWE a couple of decades later, when being able to go in the ring had become a more prized asset, he could have shone brighter. Imagine Storm in his prime going up against Chad Gable, or him having a one-on-one bout with Gunther. That would have been something special to see. Alas though, this is something we'll never see now because he's since left WWE behind and gone to work for Impact, where he currently plays a behind-the-scenes role helping to get the next generation ready. And with him apparently having no interest in coming back for one last match unless that match is a dual retirement bout against his old friend Chris Jericho, it seems unlikely we'll see him perform in a WWE ring again. But then, you can never say never in wrestling. Who knows, by the time all is said and done, we might even see our next subject return to WWE. The one, the only, Paul London. Now, that said, if Paul London ever does return to WWE, we hope he's used a lot better than he was during his initial run. Because despite becoming a Cruiserweight champion and multiple-time tag team champion back then, there's still a sense he was only utilized to half of his potential. Why was he only used to this degree? Well, like with others we've discussed today, it probably had a lot to do with his height. Yes, this is more than likely the reason such an impressive high flyer was stuck away in the purgatory of the mid-2000s SmackDown tag team division for so long, with this being a place where, rather than get a chance to mix it up with the real main eventers, he was limited to working with other tag team acts like the Basham Brothers. And it's more than likely the reason he'd be an easy cut for WWE to make once it came time to trim down the roster in 2008. Obviously, it goes without saying then that more could have been done with the Austin native, and that if he'd come along today, he'd probably have found much more success. But back at that time, if you wanted to get over in WWE and your name wasn't Rey Mysterio, you'd better be a hell of a lot bigger than Paul London was. So instead of making it in WWE then, London had to spend the remainder of his career after he got fired in places like Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Lucha Underground, and Impact. Places in which, while he could get a chance to show what he could do, he was still working for a much smaller audience. But what of the tag team division a few years after this? Had it improved much in terms of helping undervalued stars get the credit they deserved by then? Well, not quite yet. And the prime evidence of this being the case can be found in our next subjects, the Ascension. Now, the Ascension were never going to be WrestleMania main eventers or anything. Yes, they were always more of a mid-card act, and during the time they were on NXT, it seemed Triple H realized this, as he was able to utilize them properly there by having them serve as foils to the likes of the Lucha Dragons and Finn Balor and Hideo Itami. Once they moved up to the main roster in early 2015, though, all that changed, as now rather than being booked like big bully heels, they were instead booked like the biggest of all jobbers. And this was clearly seen in the way they were buried by both the NWO and the APA on a Legends Night episode of Raw on January 19th of that year. Yes, imagine if Hawk and Animal of the LOD had been presented this way. It would have been an instant end to their credibility. And it was also death for the Ascension then, as from this point forward, there would be no saving them on the main roster. No, now whenever they came out to the ring, no one treated them like a threat, and no one saw them as a powerhouse team. So rather than find themselves entering into title contention at any point or getting any notable big wins, Connor and Victor would mill around doing little of note for the next 5 years, with their profile being so low at various points that it became almost impossible to remember they were still employed by WWE. But they were. In fact, even as late as 2018's Greatest Royal Rumble show, they were there, getting eliminated in short order. Unfortunately for the Ascension, however, not long after this, their time really would come to an end, as in December of that same year, they'd be cut from their contracts and sent out to pasture, with this pasture being their local indies. Yes, it's unfortunate that things went down this way for them, but then the same could be said for everyone we've discussed today, because as we've shown, each and every one of them deserved better than what they ultimately got. We can only hope then that at least for a few of these performers, it's not too late to get a second chance.